This interview is part of the SSCA Circumnavigators Summit, sharing experiences of members who circumnavigated. All engaged in this project are volunteers providing information solely for entertainment and education purposes. SSCA may edit and publish the interviews in the SSCA Circumnavigation Summit in audio and video formats to benefit its membership and as a recruiting tool. SSCA and participants assume no responsibility for the accuracy or validity of information shared in these interviews. Opinions stated do not necessarily reflect those of the Seven Sea Cruising Association.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the SSCA Circumnavigators Summit. My name is Jackie Lee from Trimaran Sloopmoosh, and I have the privilege to interview some of these special members who have completed a circumnavigation. Many volunteers at SSCA are working hard to make the organization new and fresh and relevant to our members. So we hope you will enjoy this new series. Many sailors wonder what it takes to make a circumnavigation and whether they could do it. We will be interviewing SSCA members who did it. Believe it or not, over 100 members sailed around the world just in between the period between 2001 and 2019. And bravo to them. You will have a chance to hear many varied types of sailors. Solo sailors, families, 2 to 3 year voyages, 20 plus years, international members, former SSCA board members, motor vessel owners, celebrities, and regular sailors just like us. So, without further ado, let's get right to the interview. Okay, folks, I think that this is going to be a very interesting and informative interview today with our guest, Rob Dubin, who sailed on the vessel Ventana and is now living in Salida, Colorado, speaking with us today. Just as a little bit of background about Rob and Dee, who went around the world together, back in 2000, there were not many boats that had blogs, and so theirs was hugely popular as they started a blog and in the early days. They were professional filmmakers, and from 1989 to 1995 produced a series of videos called Sailing Quarterly Video Magazine, which was very popular and had lots of guest hosts like Gary Jobson, Donald Street, Tristan Jones, Hal Roth, and others. They also did videos on safety at sea and heavy weather sailing, and also a video on outfitting a cruising sailboat, which was very popular. Very nice to have you with us today, Rob. So how are you today?
Doing great. Excited to continue contributing to SSCA.
Okay, great. Can you give us a little bit of background about how you got into sailing, and how you and Dee got into sailing, and what went before your cruising?
Well, my wife Dee spent her summers on the vineyard on Martha's Vineyard when she was growing up, so she did some sailing. But I never really even got in a sailboat till I was about 18 years old, and the first couple times were nothing particularly astonishing. And I eventually learned to sail on a reservoir in Colorado, a little small reservoir, and I took sailing lessons. When I was a young kid, National Geographic followed an 18-year-old California boy named Robin Lee Graham on the boat Dove while he's in National Geographic over a number of years. And it really captured my imagination, this young kid traveling around the world on his own. And I was very adventurous. I was a mountain climber. I'd done and Alaska, and some kayak explorations on unexplored rivers. So I was very adventurous in that regard. But it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I started sailing. And not long after my wife and I took our sailing classes in Colorado, we combined our professional business of making movies with making movies about sailing.
All right. That's quite interesting, Rob. It's a little bit like Luke and I when we didn't know when we met each other, we didn't know anything about sailing. And we worked at a resort, and we did the same thing. We took lessons on a Hobie Cat and ended up pitch poling and plunging the mast into the sand. Okay.
Oh, well, that is exactly my first experience, yeah.
Okay, auspicious beginnings for both of us. When did you decide to get a big boat and do some serious cruising sailing?
Well, we combined our business expertise as filmmakers with this idea of making sailing movies. And from 1989 till about 1995, we produced dozens of different sailing films. We had basically a video magazine where people subscribed like a print magazine, and we sent them a 1 hour long video cassette every 3 months. And so they subscribed year round. And when we started making that, we were very much novice sailors, knew very little. We had taken a few sailing classes. That was it. But the people in front of the camera, I was, of course, behind the lens, but the people in front of the camera were some of the most experienced sailors in the world. Kerry Jobson, who's head of the United States Sailing Association and was an America's Cup tactician for Ted Turner, he was the host of it. And then individual segments were hosted by people like Don Street and then Tristan Jones, Hal Roth, John Ruminaire, and some yacht designers, people like that. So they were actually teaching us about sailing while we were teaching our viewers. So we were total novices when we started this, but our education was pretty amazing because we were learning from the best in the world. And we weren't just out for a day of sailing when we were with these people. We were making training segments on how to reef your boat or how to do certain things or navigate or whatever it was. So we were, it was like drinking from a fire hose. We were really getting an amazing education from all these people. And we were also at the same time sailing on, 50, 60, 70 boats a year for 5 or 6 years. So that when it came time to select our own boat, we had a very good idea of everything we wanted on the boat, how we wanted it rigged. The videotapes we had made were much like a magazine. They might have one story on sailboat racing and then a story on maybe cruising in Tahiti or how to fix something on your boat, or we might do tests where we tested different reefing systems or anchors or things like that. We actually did some of the first really good anchor tests we did with a group of people, the U.S. Navy, and put this together, and all the anchor manufacturers. We did these anchor tests where we had cameras underwater filming the anchors digging in, and we had divers down there measuring how far the anchor dragged before it dug in. And we were the first people, I think, to film anything like that. And then we had tugboats on the surface, with strain gauges measuring how much the anchors held. So when we came to select our own boat, we had a vast amount of really not just sort of anecdotal knowledge, but real tested knowledge of what worked and what didn't. And we selected an island packet. And when we were working with the island packet company, we knew them quite well because they had been part of our video series. We made a video of us selecting our boat, why we selected it, how it was made, and then all the systems that we added onto it. What kind of windlass, what kind of anchors, what kind of sail reefing system, and that sort of thing. And we really liked the Island Packet because it was a full keel cutter rigged boat, which were kind of our base criteria. But it was extremely well built, very solid. The pinion is a rack and pinion steering, so it doesn't have cables to break. I had previously been on a boat on filming one of our stories where the steering cable broke just as we were in a current in the Bahamas with about a 5-knot cross current. We nearly demolished a whole bunch of boats. So I knew I didn't want cable steering, for instance. The Island Packet has the rudder, and it's a very big, balanced rudder, and it had a real heavy strut to the bottom of the rudder. And this really helped us so that we could, when we were offshore in some big storms, we let our autopilot continue steering our boat, and when huge waves would break over the boat, it would shove the boat sideways in the water, but I wasn't ever worried about the rudder breaking because I knew how it was built.
Wow, what an amazing story, and what a great way to get an education all about sailing and from the experts. That was a pretty amazing gig you got there. Lucky guy.
It was quite unique and wonderful, and certainly prepared us really well for sailing. We had the chance to sail all over the world.
All right, lucky you. Okay, so now we know you chose an Island Packet. When did you plan finally to do your own circumnavigation, and what year did you start, and from where?
Well, we had, as we continued doing our videos, we definitely knew we wanted to go sailing someday, but we never really put a timeline on that. But after we had made our video magazine for about 6 years, and we had grown to about 10,000 subscribers, which was a pretty good number, but we really couldn't get any bigger. And we just finally decided it was time to put that business aside, sell the assets of it, and go off on our own. So we kind of spun it off. We had done some TV work before, and we ended up repackaging our programs. We had a TV series on ESPN about sailboat racing, and we had another one on the Travel Channel about the world that we had done these little clips of. And so we had a TV series on the Travel Channel, and we kind of put that aside and decided to buy our own boat. And we worked out this arrangement with Island Packet to do this film as we outfitted our boat. So that helped us in the purchase of our boat. And so in September or October of 1995, we took delivery of our boat right near the Island Packet factory in Largo, Florida, near St. Petersburg, Florida. And we spent about 6 months outfitting the boat, and I think it was maybe February of 96 we took off and did what we certainly advise many people to do, is take baby steps. And we took off and cruised the Bahamas our first winter, and then in the summer of 96, we came back to the U.S. and made a few minor changes on the boat. We had learned a few things. And we sailed all up the east coast of the United States that summer, which was wonderful. And then in the fall, we came back down the east coast of the U.S. and then eventually back to the Bahamas and continued on into the Caribbean.
Yes, I think that's quite a good plan, a wise plan to, like you say, start with baby steps, even though you had all that expertise of learning behind you. It's always great to stick around the area for a bit and then come back and do those little projects where you say, okay, I think it'll be better if you do this or that, and do some little improvements.
Our plan had really been to, retire for 2 or 3 years. We figured 3 years and sail for 3 years and then go back to work. And we got down into the Caribbean, and what money we had invested in the stock market, and it was doing very well in those years. And so our 2 or 3 years kind of turned into 3 or 4 or 4 or 5 or 5 or 6. And we ended up spending 7 years cruising the Caribbean, kind of up and down and back and forth. And we not only did the Eastern Caribbean, we came up the Western Caribbean along the South America and Central America coast, Mexico. And somewhere about after 6 or 7 years, we then decided we were going to circumnavigate. So I think it was 2001 or 2000, we came back to the U.S., and we had been out about 6 years, and we spent about 6 or 8 months adding things to the boat. We put on a bigger water maker and a little more fuel tankage and made some other changes. And then we headed back down through the Caribbean again through the Bahamas and the Caribbean islands that we knew very, very well by that point. And then we continued on past Bonaire, where we loved to scuba dive, and on toward the Panama Canal. And then I believe it was April of 2002 that we headed across the Pacific.
All right, and then after that, the general route you took was the milk run kind of run?
Yeah, we pretty much did what most people do, Panama Canal, Marquesas, onto the Marquesas, where we met you guys, incidentally. It had a wonderful experience with Luke and driving us over the mountains of Tahiti in a Jeep. And we really enjoyed. We still remember that and talk about it. It was a really spectacular day. But then we did what most people do. Well, we didn't do what everybody does. One of the things that I have advised many people subsequently is to not. So many Americans, their first year, they get to Tonga and then all the way down to New Zealand in their first year, the same year that they left the Panama Canal. And I think that's a huge mistake to rush through the South Pacific so much. So we left our boat, the first cyclone season, we left our boat in Tahiti, and then the next year we continued on, spent more time in the Tuamotus scuba diving, and then on through the rest of the French Polynesia and on to Australia. But when people ask me now, I tell them the best thing that I recommend is leave your boat in Tahiti in the marina at Tahiti-Iti or in Raiatea, and leave your boat there for one cyclone season, and then the second cyclone season leave your boat in Fiji, and by doing that spend 3 full year cruising seasons in the Pacific, because it's just so fascinating and you just can't get back there. And some places like Fiji, there's so much to see. You couldn't possibly do it in a single season. The other option is, I think, maybe what you guys did, and I know what some of our other friends did, is to go up to the equator during the cyclone season and continue cruising and doing some of the northern Pacific islands there.
I couldn't agree more on your recommendation to not rush through the Pacific, because, back at that time, the Americans, I think, or non-Europeans, had only like 3 months that they could spend in French Polynesia, which was really a shame. But now I think they can spend up to 3 years, or keep the boat there for 3 years. So, and I was lucky because Luke being a European, we got to stay there because of the European Union. Yeah, and I agree that the Pacific is a wonderful place and hard to get back to.
Exactly. And then we ended up spending 3 years in Australia. Well, we left our boat there for 3 years. One of those years we came back to the U.S. and had a little flying adventure where I flew a small gyroplane around the U.S. Became the first person to ever fly to every state. But anyway, we left our boat in Australia for several years and then moved on to Indonesia, which was really fascinating for us. And then the usual Thailand, and we also spent about 3 years in Thailand. And then we did the Maldives and Sri Lanka, and we came up the Red Sea, and that was kind of at the height of the worst piracy right then off of Oman and Yemen. And it was quite scary and dangerous, and since then things have eased off a little bit. But then we came up the Red Sea into the Med. We didn't enjoy the Med all that much from a sailing perspective. I mean, the things we did in the Mediterranean, other than the Greek islands, most of the things we did were things that you could do ashore and staying in a hotel or pension. So we didn't think that was such great sailing, particularly. And then we did the usual, on to the Canary Islands and Cape Verdes and Barbados, and then we got to the Caribbean, which completed our circumnavigation, and then we continued on up the Caribbean, back again through there, and the Bahamas, back to the U.S. in 2012. And so that had been about 17 years since we had first started off in 1995.
That's the way to do it. Take it leisurely, take it nice. Spend some time, like you said, you spent your time going through the Pacific on 3 different seasons, and then spend some years in Australia and some years in Southeast Asia. I think that's a great way to do it.
Another thing that I remember we did just before we left the Canary Islands, there were obviously lots and lots of sailors gathering for their passage across the Atlantic. The Ark was there at the same time. And there were a lot of Europeans and Australians and Kiwis who hadn't yet been to the Americas. And I did a number of chart briefings and things like that in talks for people on where to go when they got to the U.S. But one of the things that we found that a lot of the Kiwis and Aussies were anxious to get to the Pacific, and they really didn't do justice to the Caribbean and the Bahamas. And so I certainly encouraged people, if they're U.S. sailors that maybe start from the West Coast, or Europeans or whatever, Kiwis and Aussies that are anxious to move on, don't give short shrift to the Bahamas and the Caribbean, because that's some of the best sailing also in the world, and just gorgeous waters, really friendly people. So much like my South Pacific advice would be to not rush through the Bahamas or Caribbean. And for East Coast sailors, starting off from the East Coast, it's really a great place to go. I mean, the South Pacific is probably what most of us dream about when we think of cruising. But the Bahamas is 90% as good as the South Pacific, and it's 50 miles off the coast of Florida. And so East Coast sailors, it's really worth spending time, a year or two, exploring the Bahamas. And the other thing about taking baby steps, when we started, we watched the weather really closely, and we had already been in big storms at sea, and we only went in good weather, and the Bahamas are a great chance to get your feet wet and not to be macho about the weather. We saw so many couples in the Caribbean, where the guy was all macho, and he had been out in 25 knots or 30 knots and didn't think it was a big deal. And he goes out and he scares his wife or partner, and then they don't go sailing anymore because she's too afraid. So you do not do yourself any favor by being macho and going out and beating your boat and your partner up when you're learning the ropes.
Yeah, I think that's also great advice. I agree completely. We remember meeting some people in the St. Martin's, I think, and what they did was, like, in 3 months, they got married, they took a power squadron course in sailing, they immediately set off to Bermuda or somewhere like that to make their way down to the Caribbean, and got into the tails of hurricanes, and then by the time they got to Caribbean, they were so beat up and so scared. And then when they left, they had so little seamanship that they were doing all these dangerous things. And a sad story was that later on we saw, after a cyclone, we saw the boat wrecked somewhere. And so it was a very sad kind of story that they had retired and then had such a nightmare, having the nightmare instead of the dream.
Exactly, and we've seen that so often where they get to the Caribbean and then the wife says, I'm flying home, and the boat's on the market, and it's the end of their sailing dream. So, don't be macho, take it slow, go in the good weather. I guess we have a question about that later on, so I'll save that for there.
Okay. Well, let's talk about SSCA. Do you remember how you heard about SSCA and why you decided to join?
Well, I guess we had sort of always known about SSCA when we were doing our video series and all that, and I think we joined somewhere while we were doing our video series, still living in Colorado. I think that's when we joined, and we sailed for quite a few years before some of our friends said, well, you guys need to be Commodores, and we had already been members and done way more than we needed to do to be Commodores, but some of our friends said, so they brought us the application. It was already signed by 3 other people that we all knew, and we were down in Trinidad at the time. And so then we became Commodores. That was maybe about 1997 or 98. And we've watched SSCA for a number of years, and there was a period when we first started cruising, the bulletins were by far the best way to get information, almost the only way, because the internet didn't really exist then. People were starting to use email, but the internet per se wasn't the wealth of information it is now, and it was very difficult to find anywhere to get internet time in those days. So the bulletin served a really important function then. And then there was a period as more and more information became available on the internet and Noonsight and things like that, and SSCA really struggled for a reason for existence. And I tried to personally get SSCA to be a shore station for email, and they didn't want to do it at the time. It was just kind of, the old guard it was hard to drag them kicking and screaming into the next century. But very luckily, to their credit, good people with ideas to move forward instead of look at the past, to look at the future, came on, and they started turning SSCA into something that was worthwhile again, because when the bulletins were no longer your only source of information, and they were still the main thing SSCA did, there wasn't really a lot of reason for people to join SSCA. And now, of course, it's done fantastic. There's a wealth of information, things like what you're doing here, and all the other training that they make possible, and the cruising stations all around the world and that sort of thing. So SSCA they weathered the storm. They moved into the new century, and again, I think they're a very, very valuable resource for cruisers. Anyway, that's our SSCA story. We're still rear Commodores now, even though we've been ashore for quite a few years.
Wow. Do you remember any story about any SSCA member that you met, or a cruising station that that helped you out, or was some sort of memorable experience?
Not really. We started a cruisers Christmas gathering in St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And at first it just started out, we knew so many people in the Caribbean, and we'd all set out hurricane season. And so we just decided to have a Christmas gathering there. And then there were so many of us that were doing it that were SSCA members, we just decided to make it an official SSCA function. And that grew exponentially through the late 90s. The first year we had maybe 20 people, and we had a big potluck and a 3 or 4 day get together. And by 2000, it was huge. We had hundreds and hundreds of people. So that was a real great thing. And then I have something else to talk about SSCA, but I think I'll leave it for later on one of your other questions.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, there you are. You're the SSCAer and getting the group of people together and doing the GAM and the camaraderie thing and starting a movement of bringing people together. So that's the story. You're the story, Rob.
Actually, I think there's one other thing I will add. Again, there's so much information available now that everybody knows more today than many people did when we first started cruising, just because information was not so readily available. And I think that SSCA members, they set a certain bar that you were if you were flying the Red Burgee, you had done a certain amount of sailing and you kind of knew your stuff. And so people aspired to be that way because of the clean wake policy. And so I think people kind of aspired to be SSCA members, and it became flying the Burgee wasn't just a way to connect with other members, but it became a goal for non-members to meet that standard, I think. And that sort of raised everybody up, and just more of the clean wake policy spread to other cruisers, I would say.
You put off a little bit about your weather story, so now we're on the question. How did you manage to sail in good weather, and did you avoid bad weather? And what's the worst weather story you lived through, and any advice you can give us?
Well, my wife actually has the very best weather advice, and she says, the only weather you control is the weather you leave port in. And if you knew nothing else about weather and you just took that one bit of advice, it would probably keep you out of trouble 99% of the time. Really, especially for people other than your big ocean crossings, especially today, the weather reporting is so much better than when we started. You can get pretty accurate weather for 5 days almost anywhere in the world. And so other than your ocean crossings where you're just going to be out there and get what you get, almost all your other passages are going to be less than 5 days, or not much more than that. So if you just get good weather reports and only leave port in a good weather forecast, you're going to avoid 90% of the problem. So that would be the best advice. And what I said earlier, don't be macho and say we've been out in 25 knots or more and it's no big deal. Because we've all probably been out in that, but it's not fun. And if it's not fun, it's not fun. And why subject yourself to that? And I learned a lot about weather. I'm also an airplane pilot, not a commercial pilot, but a private pilot. So I've studied a lot of weather both as a sailor and as a pilot. And we just really, early days, we had to spend a huge amount of our day downloading weather faxes that were really, really slow over our single sideband connection and all that. But we spent a big part of our day getting weather reports, listening to Herb and all that stuff. Now it's so much easier and so much more accurate that there's really not a lot of reason to get caught out in bad weather. I remember one year we were in Bonaire for what happened called a reversal, where in the Caribbean, the wind blows from the east about 364 days of the year, and a couple of times a year it switches around, which is really dangerous because everybody is almost always anchored on the western sides of the islands, and if the wind comes from the other way, you're now on a lee shore. And in Bonaire, there were a number of us that had been there, and I think 1999 when there was a really bad reversal, and we all had to undo our mooring lines. People were sailing all over the harbor in the dark. It was a total nightmare, and went from total calm to like 5-foot waves breaking over our bow at anchor in about a 15-minute period. And 2 years later, we were back in Bonaire, and the same thing happened. They got another reversal. Well, all of us really experienced sailors who had been through the first one put our tails between our legs and rushed into the marina where they guaranteed space for everybody. And all the macho sailors that were way less experienced stayed out at anchor. And of course they all got beat up and a couple boats got washed ashore and all that. So don't be macho, be a wimp and sail when there's good weather. We ended up in 17 years, we went through 3 major storms. Our first year, actually, we sat out a hurricane at anchor, and we'd only been on our boat less than a year. And we sat out at anchor in Martha's Vineyard, and we were safe. We went far away from everybody. But it was probably not the best decision. I mean, boats can be replaced and your lives can't. So we did do that. I think if I had to do another hurricane, I'd leave the boat. But anyway, in the 17 years we sailed, we ended up 3 different times in big storms. Once in the Pacific, once in the Indian Ocean, and once in the Atlantic. And the Pacific Ocean storm is kind of another lesson learned. We were at Maupiti, which is the farthest westernmost reef in French Polynesia. And when you leave there, you're on a multi-day passage to the Cook Islands. And, going to sea is always a, big deal. You got to put everything away, and we'd hoist our dinghy up on deck and all of this. So we had been watching the weather. We had a good weather window. And so we, said our goodbyes ashore and we provisioned up a little bit and hoisted the dinghy on deck and put the outboard away and got everything ready. And we were just pulling out of the harbor. We motored past some friends to tell them goodbye. And our friend said there's a little bit of a low developing. And we were all ready. We had pulled anchor. We were on our way out. And we just said, well, we'll deal with it. And sure enough, we got spanked really badly, 30-foot waves higher than the spreaders.
Whoa.
A lot of boats got really severely damaged. We were, in our island packet, we were able to continue sailing with just our staysail up. And we continued moving forward. But we were about a day and a half out at sea on, I think, a 4 or 5 day passage. And it started raining so hard that we couldn't see anything. We couldn't see anything on radar. And for the first time ever in our lives, I hoisted a strobe light into the spreaders, and we went down below, and we lashed ourselves down below, and we didn't go on deck for a day and a half.
Wow.
And we couldn't have seen anything more than about, we could barely see the bow of the boat for a lot of that time. And about 2 or 3 times an hour, giant waves would break clear over the cabin top on the boat and shove the boat sideways through the water like 3 or 4 feet. And if I had been on a boat with a spade rudder, I probably would have broken the rudder. But again, in our island packet, it was sturdy enough to take it. But we didn't break anything, but we had a really pretty miserable 36 hours down below deck. And we limped into port a couple days later, and then boats came in after us that had started before us. They had hove to at sea for a couple days, but a lot of boats were damaged all over from this storm. And we had known about it just as we left, so we could have avoided that. Our second big storm happened years later in the Indian Ocean. We were already at sea, and there's not much we probably could have done about it. But our weather faxes just showed this little blank area, like as if the weather fax wasn't working. It was like there was a little white kind of 2-inch wide thing in the middle of our 8x10 weather fax. And it was that way for 3 days. And I was like, well, there must be some error in the way that transmission is going. And this is when we were getting weather faxes over our single sideband and all that. And finally, one day it showed a tropical depression forming there. We had already been out at sea, so there's not much we could have done about that. But again, we had the same kind of conditions, 36 hours of really terrible weather. And then our last one was sort of the same thing. We were out at sea on our way to the Canary Islands, and or maybe I think it was from the Canary Islands to the Cape Verdes, and we were already at sea when the forecast started. We did everything we could to batten down, but same thing. It ripped off my radome, which was about 15 feet off of the deck.
Wow.
And, broke over the boat many times. And then again, that was the worst thing. The only damage we had was my radome mount had been ripped off. But then when we were in the Cape Verdes, other boats limped in with, their entire self-steering gear ripped off and sails shredded and things like that. So we felt pretty lucky in 3 years to only have 3 really bad, in 17 years to only have 3 really bad storms.
Right. Wow. Yes, and it seems that you had a good sturdy boat. Like you say, nowadays the weather predictions are easier to get and quite accurate now, but I think people still have to know very well how to hove to and what kind of things to do in heavy weather.
Absolutely. I mean, we did, when we were making our movies, we did videos on safety at sea where we filmed, we worked with the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard and all that, and we filmed, how to heave to in different kind of boats, different kind of conditions. I remember Larry Pardee at the time was working on or this was later, but Larry was working on a drag device, experiences of people who had put out parachutes and drogues, and we did things like that, and we filmed that. We filmed how to set your drogue, and we had done all that. And also, this is an SSCA thing. We had gotten together with a number of SSCA boats. I think it was while we were in Bonaire. We did it the first time, but we did it a number of different places where, because we had this experience where we had made these videos on heavy weather sailing and that sort of thing, we taught sort of little mini seminars for other cruisers, and it was usually kind of an impromptu SSCA organized thing where we went out with people and we did man overboard drills. For instance, we took about five boats worth of people. We went at 5 different couples. We all went out on one boat, and we let each couple practice a man overboard drill where the man went overboard and the woman had to do everything to get him back aboard. And I sat there and we timed them, and I noted what they did well, what they didn't do well, and then we had group critiques afterwards. And of course we did it with safety. We had safety boats in the water that we had dinghies in the water that could rescue if we needed and all that. So that was all really good practice and to help teach other people. And that's something I encourage cruisers to do. Get together with 2 or 3 other boats and go out on somebody's boat and practice and see if you have the right gear and if your gear really does work. And this is another thing that Don Street taught me. He said, have you ever tried steering with your emergency tiller? And that's something that everybody should do. Go out at sea, put your emergency tiller on, or go out in the harbor even, and see number one, do all the pieces fit together? Does it work? And what does it feel like to steer with that emergency tiller? And that's something that everybody should practice, as well as heaving to and other things.
Great advice. Let's go to a different subject now. What about communications? How did you stay in touch with your family and friends? And how did it evolve? And you have any advice for anyone starting a world voyage now?
Well, I think when we left in '95, email was really just in its early stages. And so for most of our friends, goodbye was really goodbye, because, you might send a postcard once, but nobody was going to really write you a letter. And so really the only people we communicated with the first couple of years were our families. And in those days, to make a phone call in the Bahamas, you had to go to the Batelco office and stand inside this noisy office with all these machines whirring and make a phone call, and you'd say, "Hi, Mom, I'm okay, you okay? All right, goodbye." And that was about $20 worth right there.
I remember that.
Yeah. Then when email came out, we were pretty early on. We got our ham radio licenses through an SSCA training. We did some SSCA training, and then SSCA put on the ham radio exams. My wife got hers first, and then I got mine later on. And that allowed us to have packed to our modem, hooked up to our ham radio. And so then we could start to do somewhat reliable email, especially even in those days. There were 2 places in Trinidad that had 2 little internet cafes that all told had about 6 computers, and there'd be 200 cruisers waiting in line to pick up their email. I think for our last Atlantic passage, I had a satellite phone by then, so I would use the satellite phone once a day to download email and weather. And today, of course, it's so much easier, and there's so many good sources of weather information.
Now, one of the things that is a question many people ask, people that travel around the world in boats: what about piracy? aren't you worried about pirates? And did you ever have a situation? And what kinds of things can we do about it? Do you have any stories? And how did you deal with security?
Well, when we first started cruising, there had actually been some piracy episodes in the Caribbean, and actually a cousin of Dee's who had been cruising in the 80s had a terrible story about being attacked, and she wrote a book about it. And there was piracy, and it was really because of the drug running in the Caribbean. They would basically take over a boat and throw the owners overboard and use it to run a load of drugs to the U.S., and then they'd dump the boat. And so it was a little bit of a reality in the late 80s and early 90s. I think by the time we were out there wasn't much of that left, but a little bit. But the problem was, again, because there was no internet, there was no really good source of reliable information. Every piracy report in the Caribbean got blown out of proportion because it got reported 30 different ways and different times, and they got the name of the boat wrong, so when somebody else told it, it was a different boat.
Right.
So what was one experience ended up sounding like 30 different episodes. And so some friends of ours, John and Melody Pompa, I can't remember the name of their boat right now, they started the Caribbean Safety and Security Network in about 96 or 97, and I'm pretty certain it's still going now. And they started getting a reliable database of what was happening. And for most of the time we cruised in the Caribbean, there was very little piracy, in fact. I mean, there'd be one case every year or two. But then it started getting bad. We first cruised Venezuela with Don Street on his boat in about 1990, and it was wonderful. And then when we went back on our boat in 98, there was already some piracy things and that sort of thing. So, yeah, there was a little bit of it. It's definitely gotten worse in Trinidad and Venezuela for sure. When we never worried about too much in Venezuela. The one time we were worried, we were the only cruising boat anchored in a bay with a whole bunch of fishermen, and there were, it was really scary being around them. And one day I had just dropped Dee off on a little tiny islet to pick some mussels, and just as I did that, I was in the dinghy floating next to the little islet. I couldn't land there, and the fishing boat came around the corner, and they came right for us. And I couldn't really leave Dee there, but I moved off in my dinghy, and they altered course and came right at me in the dinghy. And I moved again, and they altered course and came right at me again in the dinghy. And I was getting pretty nervous, and they came right up to me, and just as they got right next to me, the guy in the bow leans down behind the gunnel, and I don't see what he's doing, and he came up with 2 big fish and threw them into my dinghy. So that was my first experience with pirates, and that was generally how it usually goes. Although I will say, when we sailed up the South China Sea from Langkawi and up to Thailand and all that by ourselves, not really with other boats, and we never felt threatened. So I don't know whether it was wise or not, but we didn't ever feel threatened. We did feel really vulnerable when we were leaving Oman to go to Yemen, to get to Aden in Yemen, because that's really the worst. It was the worst area. That's where the Captain Phillips movie was, and that's where they were taking lots and lots of boats when we were there. And we went with 4 other boats, and we maintained radio silence. And I wrote an SSCA article on all the anti-piracy strategies that we developed. And that article probably appeared in about maybe it was 2006 or 7, somewhere in there. And it was really scary, and boats came by us, and we'd see them on the radar, and, it's like they went by us, and if they didn't pull out AK-47s, I guess they weren't pirates. But there was nothing we could have done if they chose to go after us. We had 4 boats together. We sailed really close, much closer than you'd ever want to normally sail.
Right.
We had no lights on at night, and we were a quarter mile apart from each other. and nobody bothered us. But I don't know if it was the luck of the draw or what. We did we maintained radio silence. We gave fake radio reports as to where we were. We had no lights on and all that. So I can't advise people to put themselves at risk. We did it. We were okay, but it was a scary time. And then we had some friends had a very interesting experience. After we got to Aden, we thought we were mostly in the clear because we were past where most of the piracy episodes had been against the big ships. And we left Aden a day before some of our friends, and there's a little anchor. To go up the mouth of the Red Sea is very narrow, and you need to do it with the tide in the area called the Gate of Tears, the Bab el Mandeb, the entrance to the Red Sea. So there's an anchorage just a couple hours away from that. So we anchored there to leave at like 4 a.m, and there were all these fishermen around us. We didn't have any problems. We had something that was a little weird, but we didn't know what it was with them. I won't go into it. But the next day we told our friends about this anchorage that they could stay there and before they went on up the Red Sea. And so they stayed there, and the fishing boats that had been all around us came over and approached them and said, "Are you guys okay? Do you need anything?" And my friend said, "Well, we're a little afraid of the pirates." And the guy said to him, We're the pirates, and we're not going to bother you. Don't worry."
Oh.
So take that for what it's worth. I have no idea whether the guy was facetious or real or what. Another friend of ours on the boat, Tactical Directions, a fast catamaran, sailed up that mouth of the Red Sea, and just past there's a little island, and he got chased by some customs guys, and he just kept on going, and he outran them. So I don't really know what to say. I know it's gotten much worse in Venezuela and Trinidad than it used to be, and it's been serious there the last few years. I don't know. You can read my best suggestions of what we came up with was in this article that I published in SSCA maybe around 2007 or something.
Okay, that's good. People can look that up in the index and see what they can find for that. All right, another question that many people get asked is, how can you afford it? How did you sustain yourself financially? Well, we have a hint of what you did. So if you could just recap that, and did you see ways that other cruisers who weren't so fortunate to make all that money before, any other cruisers doing something en route that you remember?
Well, I'll tell you two different stories that really don't answer your question, but they answer a more important question. So when we first were out, after we'd been out half a dozen years and we'd be back in the States or something, and people would, say, "Oh, you're so lucky to be doing that. I wish I could do something like that." And I would always be really modest and humble and, scuff my shoes in the dirt and say, "Oh, yeah, we're really lucky," and all that. But after a while, when I would hear that, I would just say, "Bullshit." And somebody would say, "You're so lucky to be doing that. That's what I'd love to do." And I would, if I could afford it, or if my wife was this, or if our jobs ended, or whatever. And I just said, "Bullshit." And they'd look at me aghast because they expected some other response. And I say, if you want to do it, you'll go out and do it. And there's really people of every price range out there doing it. Our first year in the Bahamas, I met a guy named Jack. So this is 1995, and if people know Stocking Island in Georgetown, where hundreds of boats congregate every winter, I met a guy named Jack. He was on about a 25-foot boat that he had paid, I think, $1,000 for and fixed up. And we were on our brand new island packet, which we had spent a fair amount of money on and fixed up and outfitted exactly how we wanted for the perfect lifestyle. And Jack and I sat on the same beach every day. We played volleyball on the same volleyball beach every day, and he watched the same sunsets I did. When it came time to go to town, I jumped in my big dinghy with my big outboard and roared across the harbor to town. He had to sail his whole boat over there and then put his dinghy in the water and row into town. but we were doing the same, having the same experiences other than that. And one day Jack confided to me, he said, Rob, things are a little tight for me this winter. But he had been a motorman on a subway. He was Canadian. He'd been a motorman on a subway somewhere. And he said, Rob, things are a little tight for me now, but next year my pension kicks in. I'll be getting $220 a month, and I won't have a care in the world.
I like that.
He was spending $220 a month. We were spending $1,000 or $2,000, and we had a friend spending $5,000, and we were all out there on the same beach, snorkeling with the same fish, doing the same things. So if you want to make it happen, you'll make it happen. On a more practical note, we thought we were going for 3 years, and we had saved up enough money to do that. The stock market was really good. I paid a lot of attention to making investments, and so basically we were making more money on our stocks than we were spending. So while we were sailing, our nest egg was growing, and that happened for quite a few years until, the market bubble. But anyway, that's what we did.
And if you really want to do it, you'll find a way to do it. Okay, well, you may not have your wife with you, though. Did Jack have a wife?
No, he didn't have a wife. He may have found one along the way. I don't know.
That's the only other consideration. Okay. With hindsight, would you have done something differently?
I think the main thing I would have done differently is what I mentioned earlier. I wish we had spent an additional year in the Pacific and left our boat in Tahiti for a cyclone season and come back and done another year there. That would be my biggest regret. I don't think too many other things. I think we loved every minute of it. We had high expectations for how wonderful cruising was going to be, and it exceeded our expectations by 10,000%. By far the best thing I think you can do with your life. We love the life we live now back ashore, doing things we couldn't do while we were sailing, but I don't think we'll ever again in our lives do anything as wonderful as that was. And we literally, for the first 5 or 6 years, we literally pinched ourselves every day just saying, do you believe we're so lucky we get to be doing this? And that's certainly how we still feel today.
That's great. And was there some particular event that was like the biggest highlight of your voyage, or was it the whole thing? Well, and I'll talk maybe a little more about this at the end. I do a speech. I'm going to do some public speaking now, and I do a talk about kind of what we learned from sailing, and I'll maybe do that at the end. But I would say that one of the things, at first when you start out, it's all about you, and you're figuring out how to do all this stuff, and you're figuring out how to anchor together and go through storms together and provision together and all these things, and it's kind of all about you. And then most cruisers realize when you sail into these poor countries that, we all tried to carry supplies for whether it's giving away clothes or school books or, toothbrushes. We always carried all that kind of stuff, lots of school supplies. We used to carry material and sewing needles and things and thread that we gave to the women. I'd carry fish hooks and batteries that I could give away to the men and things like that. And so we were always kind of doing that. But after you cruise long term, you realize it's no longer, you know how to do it. It's not about you anymore. And then it's making a bigger impact than just leaving behind the school supplies and the T-shirts, because next year they're going to need school supplies and T-shirts. So what you did was just kind of a Band-Aid. And so we kind of wanted to make a bigger impact. And we wanted to, you feel a need to contribute to something bigger than yourself. And we left Australia with the Indonesia Darwin to Kupang rally and Indonesia rally because it was simpler to join the rally and let them do all the paperwork for Indonesia, which was quite onerous. So we weren't really rally kind of people necessarily, but we joined the rally. And when we got to Indonesia,
a young woman approached us on the beach and offered to be our guide around Kupang, the kind of medium-sized city of Kupang. She offered to be our guide if she could practice her English, and we said sure. And we spent the next several days with this young girl, and she was so amazing. If she had been in the U.S., she would be on a full-ride scholarship to Harvard. And as it was, she was on a scholarship, luckily, because her parents made about $50 a month. But she had gotten a scholarship to this teaching college. And after spending a few days with her, we realized that there must be so many other young people like her who would have no chance for a higher education, and yet were so qualified and so amazing. And so we got together with the other cruisers, and we decided to raise some money and see if we could do something with it. So we approached all the other cruisers in the rally, and we came up with this idea of setting up a scholarship fund. And within the matter of about 5 days, my wife and I met with the headmaster of the high schools, and we set up a selection process to select kids that were really bright but had economic challenges. And we met with the president of the university there, the teaching college, and he agreed. There was quite a lot of red tape to get into university, and he agreed to waive the red tape for anybody that we would financially sponsor. And so we set up criteria that, how economics, they needed the economic help, but they had to have a certain grade average and all this. And in a matter of a week, we set up a scholarship program to send kids to college, to a 5-year college program and they got out as teachers, most of them. And we wanted to continue it, so we worked with other SSCA Commodores in the following years, people that were going to be in Indonesia the next year and the year after that, and they were all SSCA Commodores. So we set up this scholarship program, and the first year we sent 3 kids to school, and now it's, I think we did this in 2006 or 7. It's still going, and we've put 42 kids through college.
Wow, that's really great.
And we certainly encourage. I wrote something about it in the SSCA magazine, I think a year or 2 ago, and it's still going. If people want to contribute, they can contribute through the Indonesia Rally Association. So every year the rally raises money from the cruisers coming through, and there's a ceremony where they award the scholarships to the next group of kids, and the kids meet the rally participants and show them what they've done, and these are the ones that have graduated, now they're teachers, and a lot of them we encourage to go back to their small communities in Indonesia, so they're teachers going back to help others. And so for us, that's by far the best thing that we did while cruising. And it's nice that we could do something that had a difference long after we moved ashore and are no longer out there doing it.
Wow, that's inspirational. I do remember reading that in the bulletin and thought that was a great thing, because it's true that you meet these people and it seems like the less money the people have, the more they give and are generous, and so you have this feeling of wanting to give back, and I think bravo to have started that and to have that continue. We're winding down now, so what else would you like to share with us before we go, Rob?
After we got back, of course, many people have asked us to write a book like they do every sailor, and we haven't done that. But I do a fair amount of public speaking, and one of the things that struck me somewhere when we were about 2/3 of the way around the world, we were back in the U.S., and we were at a Barnes & Noble bookstore, and I was walking through the bookstore, and I saw that the self-help section of the bookstore was about a half a mile long of shelves full of books on how to fix what's the matter with your life. And it really struck me that so many people, not cruisers, but the people that are back here living their lives, were unhappy with the lives they were living. And that there was a market for so many amazing books. And after we finished sailing, I came up with sort of 9 insights that I thought would lead to an extraordinary life. And they were just things that occurred to me while we sailed. And then as I went back and looked at these books, so many of the things that people are trying to learn ashore were brought clearly into focus. You know, one thing that happens, as anybody who's been on this voyage knows, you know, when you move onto your sailboat, you have to get rid of tons of stuff. We sold a big house and sold a business and another building we owned, and you know, you get rid of all your stuff because there's not very much that fits on a boat. And then as you get out there, you know, you pare away so much of civilization that is a distraction or fills your time unnecessarily. And so sailing really allowed us to focus on, you know, what was important. And I think that's what a lot of people ashore never get that chance to focus on what's important. They're too busy answering the telephone, you know, which is unimportant at that time, but it's in their ear. So I guess the things that we learned from being out sailing is, you know, the first thing we did is when we loaded up our boat, we got rid of all of our old baggage that wouldn't go on the boat. And so we couldn't put anything on the boat unless it was really going to help us sail safer or better or whatever. And so that paring down of all your possessions is a really good metaphor for getting rid of all the stories in your life that aren't serving you, why you can't go sailing, why this isn't successful, whatever. If it's a story that doesn't help you, just get rid of it. It's emotional baggage. It's not going to help you get to the next anchorage. And then the next thing with so many people feel is, you know, they're fearful of going sailing. Well, the way we dealt with our fears was I break my fear down into what am I really afraid of. If I'm afraid of getting lost, well, I'll take an extra GPS. If I'm afraid of my boat sinking, well, I'll carry extra bilge pumps. You know, so break it down into what specifically are you afraid of, and come up with a plan to deal with that specific fear. And then once you've done that, you just need to courageously go forward and face your fears. And once you do that, you are a different person. I mean, anybody who has done an ocean passage under their own keel arrives at the new port a different person than they left. They have some different attitudes about life and what they can do. Certainly, it's important to learn the practical skills you need to learn, and you asked a lot of those questions, you know. So we learned the practical skills about heaving to and taking care of our boat and how to repair the head and the engine and all those things. We learned practical skills about managing our money. And I think the other 2 things you need to learn are skills about managing your emotions and managing your relationship. So we had actually done a lot of work with a motivational speaker named Tony Robbins, and we learned from him. But there are a lot of ways to learn those different skills of managing your relationships, your finances, your emotions, your health, the practical skills you need to be a sailor. And then the next thing, when we first started sailing in the Bahamas, I remember the first port we got to, they were using ancient typewriters and carbon paper to type in our customs immigration when we were going through customs and getting our passport stamped. And so the first response is, you know, we judge this. This is so backwards. We do it so much better in the U.S. But very quickly, as we started sailing, we learned to not judge others, to just observe how they did things differently. And, you know, you certainly made the observation that we've all seen, the less wealthy the people are, the more welcoming they are to you. And so learn how to watch what they do without judging them. And then, as anybody who travels knows, when you travel, you know, you've got your antenna up and you're very aware, and you're paying attention to everything that goes on around you. You don't walk down the street in a foreign capital the way you do at home. And so you're totally present and in the moment, because it's dangerous to not be that way when you're traveling. But when you're living that way every day, day after day after day, you realize that you can't live any other way. So cruising forces us to be present and mindful. And now everywhere in the U.S., you know, there are courses on every yoga studio is doing classes on being mindful and present. And that's a skill we learned from sailing. And after doing it for every day for 17 years, we can't live any other way. the other thing, as I said earlier, to live in a state of gratitude. I mean, we pinched ourselves every day out sailing, how lucky we were. And when you see all the poor people that don't have, just for the luck of the draw of where you were born and where they were born, you have a totally different opportunity for life. You can't feel anything but gratitude. And so again, when you live every day in a state of gratitude, that's something you carry with you for the rest of your life. And so you always realize how lucky you are. And then, as I said, we certainly found a way even though we were so grateful, something was still missing in our lives, and we could spend every day doing exactly what we wanted, swimming and catching lobsters and snorkeling and walking around new towns and all that stuff. But eventually, what was missing was a way to contribute to others. And so for us, certainly the being able to set up that scholarship was our way to contribute, and it's, as answer to your question, the most satisfying thing we did in the 17 years we cruised. And then I think the last thing that cruising does, which so many people need, is it gives you an ability to live with a large degree of uncertainty in your life. And I think people that try and control their lives just make themselves miserable. And whether you're sitting at home on the couch or whether you're out in the middle of an Atlantic gale, you really can't control what's going on around you. You can be sitting at home on your couch, but you don't have control. Anything could happen tomorrow. You get hit by a bus walking across the street. And so when you learn to live with a degree of uncertainty in your life, I think that allows magic to happen, because the magic is just outside of your comfort zone. So I think if you can face your fears and be proactive, then you can get outside your comfort zone and create your own magic.
Okay, Rob, this was a great summary of what we can gain and what we learn a lot about life through sailing. I find those wonderful words of wisdom. And I think this interview has been really wonderful because you had so much to share with us, as practical as well as insightful and inner emotional kind of things. And we did take a look at your website, and I think anyone who listens to this interview will like to follow up and see some of the things that you have done with your videos and some of the things that you have to offer people. And so can you give your website name so that people could go there and then follow from there to your different offerings?
Yeah, our website is, the name of our boat was Ventana, which means window in Spanish, because she was our window to see the world. And the name of the website is ventanasvoyage.com, VENTANASVOYAGE.com. And there's no marketing of anything on the website. There's no links to anything. We learned when we were sailing and making our videos, we learned how to sail from so many selfless people who gave their time and their energy to teach us sailing. And so everything on my website is there for anybody who wants it. I don't monetize it in any way. We had lots of offers to do so, but it's just another little way of me giving back to, I can't do anything for the people that gave their time to teach me other than paying it forward.
Great. And just to give people a little bit of incentive to visit the website, I advise to anyone who's to go there and find out how you won the lottery. And that's all I'm going to say from now. Thank you so much, Rob. It's been great having this interview with you. And despite a few little glitches in our technical things, it's been a fantastic interview. And thank you so much for joining us.
Well, you guys are welcome. Thanks for doing this.
If you enjoyed this interview, make sure to listen to our other guests in the series, subscribe to SSCA YouTube channel, access the MP3 audio recording on SSCA website, Get the scoop on the latest SSCA activities and benefits. Read the latest Cruiser Bulletin, participate in the forum and Facebook group, and please promote our organization to who you think might benefit.